Have you ever felt the weight of a truth kept too long in silence? In a quiet village dusted with snow and secrets, one confession could change everything, or arrive far too late. Tonight's story is about legacy, forgiveness, and the echoes we leave behind when we finally speak. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The train pulled into the modest station just past noon, its whistle echoing faintly across the hills glazed with new snow. Jessica Fletcher stepped down carefully, a light scarf wrapped at her neck, her gloved hands clutching a worn leather satchel. Marlo's hollow greeted her with postcard charm. Gas lamps adorned with pine garlands, shutters frosted with silver, and a scent of wood smoke that brought to mind quiet evenings with thick novels. She hadn't seen Eleanor Tremblay in nearly 5 years, though their Christmas cards had never missed a season. Eleanor stood near the end of the platform, bundled in burgundy wool, her familiar smile framed by silvery curls. "Jessica," she called warmly, her voice bright despite the chill. "You look as if Cabot Cove barely let you go." Jessica embraced her old friend, noting a faint hesitation in Eleanor's hug. Something beneath the holiday spirit felt constrained. "I've missed this place," Jessica said as they walked toward Eleanor's modest sedan. "It's exactly how I remember it, though I don't recall this much snow." "Oh, we've been blessed, or cursed, with a particularly white December," Eleanor replied, her tone cheery but thin at the edges. "You've arrived just in time for the final rehearsals. The pageant has everyone busy." They drove past narrow lanes lined with icicles and curtained windows. Jessica admired the details, but her mind lingered on a slight tremor in Eleanor's hand as she adjusted the radio. A gesture so brief it could have been overlooked, but Jessica rarely overlooked anything. She turned to the passenger window and watched the snow swirl like memory over the rooftops of a village that looked pristine, and perhaps, like many such places, was anything but. The chapel was a handsome stone building at the crest of a small hill, its roof edged with snow, its stained glass windows glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Inside, the warmth of crackling radiators mingled with the sound of a hesitant choir tune being rehearsed on the organ. Jessica stood near the vestibule as Eleanor made introductions with the pride of a woman presenting her village's best. "This is Jeremy Holt, our choir director, fresh from Boston Conservatory," Eleanor said. Jeremy was tall and quick to smile, with the hands of a pianist and eyes that moved too quickly. "We're honored to have a real author among us," he said, shaking Jessica's hand. "I've always wanted to ask, do your stories come from real murders?" Jessica chuckled. "Some of them are inspired, yes, but I promise not to take notes just yet." Next came Winifred Kitteridge, a tall woman wrapped in fur and formality. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said, with the dignity of a stage actress, "it's good to see culture drawn to our little village." Her voice lingered a beat too long on little. Beside her stood Matthew, her grown son. He offered a quiet nod and averted his eyes. Jessica sensed fragility in the way he held himself, like a porcelain figure, worried it might crack. And then there was Molly Dean, a brisk young woman with flour-dusted boots and a distracted manner. "I'm just here to help Eleanor with baking and props," she said, almost defensively. Her handshake was brief, her eyes distant. As the choir resumed a carol in halting harmony, Jessica felt a growing sense that the village, like the music, was slightly off-key. People smiled, yes, but not with ease, and it wasn't the upcoming pageant that had them rehearsing their lines. She looked again at Eleanor, who had grown unusually quiet, staring at a hymnal but clearly lost in something else. Later that evening, as dusk crept across the village and lit candles flickered in the chapel's windows, Jessica found herself seated by the hearth in Eleanor's cozy cottage. The fire popped quietly, casting orange reflections in the old wooden clock on the mantel. Eleanor stirred 2 mugs of mulled cider, her hands busy, but her thoughts elsewhere. "Lawrence Kitteridge," Jessica said gently. I heard the name earlier." "He was your headmaster, wasn't he?" Eleanor paused only a second. Just enough. "Yes, head of the school for nearly 3 decades. Brilliant man, much admired." She handed Jessica her cider with a faint smile. "Winifred's late husband, of course." Jessica nodded, watching the way Eleanor avoided eye contact, how her thumb lingered over a faint scorch mark on the mug's ceramic edge. "And yet, when his name came up earlier, I sensed discomfort. Not just from you." Eleanor sat across from her and sighed. Some legacies are easier spoken of than others. Lawrence was complicated. He did much good here. But there were rumors. Years ago, a former student. It was all hushed. Time moved on. People forgot. Or pretended to. Jessica didn't press. She knew that silence, when properly observed, said more than noise ever could. Outside, wind stirred the fir trees, brushing snow from their branches like ash. Somewhere in that soft quiet, something unspoken still lingered. Something the village had agreed not to say, even when it ached to be heard. Jessica sipped her cider. She didn't yet know the full shape of what had been buried, but she'd felt enough of its outline to know that before long it would rise again, perhaps not loudly, but unmistakably. The next morning, Jessica arrived at the chapel early, drawn by the quiet and the promise of fresh scones Eleanor had mentioned. She found Molly Dean in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, apron dusted with flour, kneading dough with an intensity that suggested more than culinary devotion. "You're up early?" Jessica said gently. Molly looked up, her expression startled. "Habit. The ovens don't wait." Jessica smiled, then glanced around. "Everything smells wonderful. You're quite the baker." "It keeps my hands busy," Molly replied, then added more quietly, "and my mind quieter." Jessica tilted her head. "That's something I understand all too well." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but thick with the things left unsaid. Molly brushed flour from her palms and reached for a tray, knocking a silver spoon to the floor in the process. As she picked it up, Jessica noted the way her hand trembled. "You seem unsettled," Jessica said finally. "Is it the pageant, or something else?" Molly hesitated. "I'm just new here. People are kind, but small towns have long memories, and longer shadows." Jessica didn't respond directly. But as she left the kitchen with a warm scone in hand, she couldn't help wondering just how deep those shadows stretched, and what exactly Molly had come here hoping to bury, or perhaps to unearth. Later that day, as the choir practiced and villagers rehearsed lines for the nativity tableau, Jessica wandered up a narrow flight of wooden stairs that led to the chapel attic. Eleanor had mentioned spare costumes stored there, and curiosity, a companion Jessica rarely refused, had taken hold. The attic was dim, lit only by a narrow lancet window overlooking the hill. Dust swirled lazily in the filtered light. Old pew cushions, candle stubs, and set pieces stood propped like forgotten actors waiting to be called. What caught her attention was a large canvas draped with a linen sheet. Jessica pulled it back and froze. A painted backdrop, beautifully rendered, filled her vision. A tall, crumbling bell tower beneath a slate sky, and in the foreground, a solitary red candle, its wax dripping slowly onto stone. She stepped closer. The candle's base was surrounded by a faint, almost imperceptible ring of frost painted into the shadows. There was something solemn about it, funereal, almost sacred. Downstairs, the organ struck a chord in rehearsal. Jessica stood still. "Odd piece, isn't it?" came Eleanor's voice from the top of the stairs. Jessica turned. "Who painted it?" "No one knows. It's been up here for years. I thought it might add atmosphere to the pageant, but—" Her voice trailed. "But," Jessica prompted, "some things up here just appear." Jessica didn't speak, but her gaze returned to the candle, a symbol of memory or warning. It wasn't just art. Something in this village had burned long ago, and the wax hadn't stopped dripping. The chapel was filled with candlelight and the scent of pine garlands. Choir members, bundled in scarves and coats, moved carefully across the stone floor, their voices rising in tentative harmony. Jessica stood near the side aisle, quietly observing as Eleanor directed the final rehearsal from the front pew. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Jessica's gaze rose instinctively to the candelabra above the nave. A low hum, barely audible, preceded the full loss of power. Darkness fell, not complete, but enough to hush the voices and stir unease. A voice, sharp and frightened, cut through the silence. "Where's the breaker?" Someone stumbled. There was the rustle of robes, a metallic clang of something dropping, and then a scream, high, raw, and close. Jessica turned, heart tightening, as Eleanor called out sharply, "Lights! Someone! Bring the lanterns!" Moments later, emergency tapers were lit. Figures stood frozen, wide-eyed in the shifting glow. A few gasped. Jessica moved swiftly toward the source of the cry, passing the edge of the confessional. Its door swung wide, and there, slumped awkwardly within the wooden booth, was Jeremy Holt. His head had fallen against the partition, his face tilted toward the carved lattice, as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. His hand lay open across his lap, and in it a rosary. The beads looked old, the crucifix worn smooth. Molly Dean was crouched nearby, trembling. "I just found him," she whispered, voice thin. "I thought he was praying. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Jessica stepped forward, not too quickly, but with intent. The air felt heavy, not simply with shock, but with something older, like the weight of a door too long closed, finally giving way. Sheriff Harlan Lacey arrived 15 minutes later, his thick coat still dusted with snow. He greeted Jessica with a polite nod, then moved to examine the body. His tone was crisp but subdued, more discomfort than urgency. "Looks like natural causes," he said, straightening from his crouch beside the booth. "No signs of struggle, no trauma." Jessica's gaze remained on Jeremy. She noted how his expression had settled not in peace, but something closer to alarm. Brows furrowed, lips slightly parted, as if he'd been in mid-thought or mid-confession. She stepped gently toward the coat draped over the back of the pew near him. "Do you mind?" she asked. Harland gave a small shrug. "If it helps you sleep, Jessica." She carefully checked the coat's interior pocket and felt something folded, brittle. A single torn page, creased at the edges, yellowed faintly with age. She unfolded it slowly. In faded handwriting, slanted, deliberate, were the words, "He watches from the tower, where bells no longer ring." Jessica inhaled softly. A phrase like that wasn't random. It was remembered, or worse, repeated. "Sheriff," she said carefully, "this doesn't read like something he jotted down yesterday." He frowned but didn't argue. Molly, still seated on the nearby bench, clutched a handkerchief and stared at the stone floor. "I thought he was feeling better," she whispered. "He'd been so driven about the pageant, about something he'd found." Jessica noted the emphasis, something he'd found, and a growing tension behind Molly's grief. Not guilt, exactly, but fear. Of what? Outside, the wind stirred against the stained glass windows. Jessica's fingers tightened around the paper. Bells that no longer ring still had a voice, and Jeremy, it seemed, had been trying to hear it. The following morning, the chapel remained quiet, its doors closed and wreaths still hanging, as though the holiday had paused in respect. Jessica returned before sunrise, unable to shake the image of Jeremy's lifeless face. Natural causes. It didn't sit right. She reviewed the prior evening in her mind, the lights, the scream, the expression on Jeremy's face. There had been no visible wound, but the positioning of the body was odd, slumped, not collapsed. And that rosary, clenched rather than cradled. Inside the sacristy, she found Eleanor, pale and weary. "I can't stop thinking about it," Eleanor murmured. "It all happened so fast." Jessica nodded. "Did Jeremy seem ill recently? Exhausted? Distracted?" Eleanor hesitated. Not ill exactly, but distant. He'd been asking questions about the chapel's history, about the old tower. Jessica's attention sharpened. "Did he mention anything about Lawrence Kitteridge?" The hesitation again, slight, but present. "Only in passing. You know how stories resurface around Christmas." Jessica didn't answer immediately. Her thoughts turned to the journal page, and the wording. Not just poetic, but specific. A tower where bells no longer ring. She walked slowly toward the confessional again, retracing her steps. The interior was spotless, yet something lingered. A presence, perhaps, or simply the residue of someone who had come too close to a truth no one wished to name. Harland may have dismissed the death as coincidental, but Jessica had learned long ago that sudden endings rarely arrived without someone opening a door, and sometimes that door wasn't meant to be opened at all. That afternoon, Jessica visited the rectory, hoping to learn more about the torn page. Father Alton, a soft-spoken man with tired eyes, welcomed her into his study, where old hymnals and village records lined the shelves. She unfolded the paper and laid it on his desk. "Does this look familiar?" The priest studied it. "The handwriting's old. I've seen it before. On a ledger from the early 70s. Back when Lawrence Kitteridge was on the chapel's board, Jessica's pulse slowed. Was it his? I believe so. He gently slid the page back. Why? Jessica considered her response. It was found in Jeremy Holt's coat. That gave the priest pause. Jeremy came by just last week, asked for access to the archives, said he was researching a past injustice tied to the chapel. Jessica filed the phrase away. The wording mattered, past injustice. Before she left, Father Alton retrieved a narrow folder and handed her a photocopied entry. There, in a firm, unmistakable hand, was the phrase, "He watches from the tower where bells no longer ring." Jessica traced it with her finger. The past had a way of resurfacing not in grand gestures, but in small echoes, torn pages, repeated lines. Someone had been trying to say something. Then and now. She stepped out into the cold again, the snow falling in soft spirals. The bell tower stood in the distance, silent and unlit. But Jessica felt it, the kind of silence that hummed. Something had been buried, and someone, perhaps Jeremy, had been digging it up. Back at Eleanor's, the kettle whistled low as Jessica sat across from her friend, the journal page now resting between them on the kitchen table. "Do you remember a student named Lillian Cole?" Jessica asked gently. Eleanor stiffened, eyes lowering toward the steam rising from her cup. "Yes," she said finally. "Brilliant girl, gifted writer. She had a voice people listened to." "And?" "She died, fell from the old bell tower. It was ruled an accident." A pause. But not everyone believed that. Jessica leaned forward. "Did Lawrence know her?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "There were rumors that they were close. Too close. But it was the kind of thing people stopped speaking about once it became inconvenient." Jessica's mind was already tracing the pattern. Jeremy uncovering something. The page, the phrase. And now, the memory of a girl whose death had been too quietly explained. "Was the tower ever reopened?" she asked. "Number sealed decades ago." Eleanor's voice cracked. "People said it was cursed. I never believed that. But I did believe it was full of ghosts." Jessica watched her friend closely. There was sorrow in her words, but something else too. Protection. As if a door had once again been cracked open, and Eleanor feared what might drift through it. Jessica glanced again at the page. The bells might not have rung in years, but their silence, it seemed, still had resonance, especially when the truth refused to stay buried. The morning after Jeremy Holt's death, the village moved with a curious hush, not unlike the snow that had settled over Marlo's hollow, soft and deceptive in its stillness. Jessica made her way through the square with quiet purpose. She'd learned long ago that in towns like this, questions were best asked not with suspicion, but with gentleness, as if helping the truth remember itself. Her first stop was the chapel's annex, where Matthew Kitteridge was tending to a cracked, stained glass panel with a bottle of cleaner and a cloth that trembled faintly in his hand. "Matthew," Jessica said softly, "I wonder if I might borrow a moment." He turned, startled, eyes wide behind round spectacles. Of course, yes, Mrs. Fletcher." She stepped closer, keeping her tone warm. "I understand you were at the rehearsal when the lights went out." He nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't see anything, just confusion." "Then the scream." Jessica didn't press. Instead, she watched his hands, still shaking, not from cold. "Had Jeremy spoken with you recently?" she asked gently. Matthew paused. "He asked about the bell tower, about my father. But that's old history. My mother doesn't—" He stopped abruptly. "Doesn't like to speak of it?" Jessica offered. He nodded, relief and unease mingling on his face. Later, at the parlor of Winifred Kitteridge's home, Jessica posed a similar question. "My husband never knew that girl," Winifred said firmly, her tone sharp as glass. "Whatever Jeremy was chasing, it was fiction, the kind people write when they want to stir dust best left untouched." Her posture remained composed, but Jessica noted the way her fingers gripped the teacup, too tightly for comfort. Jessica left with no accusations, only impressions. And sometimes impressions were the beginning of answers. The village spoke in fragments, guarded tones, fleeting glances, polite refusals. But it was not silence, it was performance. Jessica knew the difference. That afternoon, back at Eleanor's cottage, Jessica sat across from her friend once more, a fresh pot of tea between them. The frost on the windows caught the light just enough to obscure the world outside, as though encouraging the past to speak freely, if only for a moment. "Eleanor," Jessica began gently, "you mentioned Lillian Cole the other day. Would you tell me more about her?" Eleanor hesitated, the teacup halfway to her lips. She set it down slowly. "She was remarkable," she said at last. "Curious, kind, unafraid to speak her mind, a scholarship student. I taught her literature, though she taught me far more about courage." Jessica watched her friend closely. There was a softness in Eleanor's voice that only memory could summon. "She fell in love," Eleanor continued. "It was clear to anyone who paid attention. But the man she loved was beyond her reach. Not because of station or age, but because he belonged to someone else." "Lawrence?" Jessica asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. There were whispers, late-night visits to the school library, a poem Lillian submitted anonymously, aching with longing, but nothing ever confirmed. "And then she fell," Jessica said softly. Eleanor's eyes misted. "From the bell tower. They called it an accident. I never believed that." Jessica reached for her notebook, not to write, but to touch it, steady herself. Grief, she thought, leaves fingerprints even after decades. And guilt. Guilt settles like snow. Quiet, persistent, refusing to melt. The following morning, Jessica returned to the chapel, this time alone. The snowfall had lightened, leaving behind a brittle crust of frozen powder atop older tracks. She circled the side of the building, where the rear entrance lay in shadow beneath the bell tower. It was there, just beyond the wooden steps, that something caught her eye. A set of muddy footprints, half frozen, distinct, leading to the chapel's back door, but not away from it. She knelt carefully, inspecting the size and shape, not Jeremy's, too large. He'd entered through the front that evening. She had seen him. She took out a pen and gently pressed its tip beside the imprint, fresh enough to still hold its depth. Whoever had left these prints had come during or just before the power outage. The door was locked now, but had it been then? As she stood, a faint sound reached her. The low thrum of a car engine, then silence. Behind her stood Molly Dean, arms crossed against the cold, eyes fixed on the footprints. "I thought I saw someone come back here last night," she said quietly. "But I didn't want to be wrong." Jessica turned slowly. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because," Molly whispered, "I've already said too much, and none of it's helped." Jessica's breath clouded in the air between them. There was more Molly wasn't saying. Jessica could feel it, but pushing now would close the door entirely. Instead, she looked back at the footprints, one set of steps, leading inward, no return path, like someone had entered with purpose, and never expected, or wanted, to be seen again. The wind had picked up by the time Jessica returned to Eleanor's, flakes swirling against the window panes like the thoughts spinning quietly in her mind. After warming her fingers by the fire, she asked if she might have a look at Jeremy's belongings. His satchel and coat had been left in the vestry, now placed respectfully in the corner of Eleanor's sitting room. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course." If it helps, Jessica knelt beside the leather bag, unfastened the buckles, and began to sort through the contents with care. A well-worn hymnal, a collection of marked-up sheet music, and several envelopes, plain, cream-coloured, and unsealed. Inside each envelope was a small Christmas card, nothing flashy, no glitter, just modest illustrations of snow-covered cottages and carolers in soft watercolours. But it wasn't the art that gave her pause, it was the writing inside. Each message was written in a different hand, some careful, others rushed, and none signed. And yet, the tone was unmistakable. "We all carry something, but mine gets heavier at Christmas. I still see her face. I still hear the bells. I never said no, that's what haunts me the most." Jessica's fingers lingered on the last one. The phrasing wasn't confessional, not quite. It was something closer to displacement, like someone whispering their guilt without ever naming it. She looked up at Eleanor, who had grown noticeably still. "You didn't know he'd received these?" Eleanor shook her head. "He never said. But he did seem preoccupied lately. More than usual." Jessica returned the cards gently to the envelope. One card had a faint smudge of what looked like wax on the bottom corner. Crimson, almost like blood, or candle wax. Jessica folded the flap. Guilt had many voices, and sometimes it sent its message not with a shout, but a carefully chosen card in December. The following morning, Jessica made her way to the chapel once more. The stillness inside was deeper than usual, not hollow, but reverent, like a space that had absorbed more secrets than song. She crossed to the choir pews where Jeremy's hymnal had last been seen. It still rested beneath the seat, tucked inside a canvas bag embroidered with his initials. Jessica opened the cover gently. The margins were filled with notes, key changes, circled verses, handwritten reminders. But halfway through, near O come, Emmanuel," something else caught her eye. A stain, deep red, wax. Jessica lifted the page, holding it closer to the light. The stain had bled slightly at the edges, and the wax had hardened into the paper grain. A drip, frozen mid-descent. It was too specific to be accidental. The hymnal had been kept in the vestry, not near the altar candles. And the colour. It matched the wax in the chapel attic backdrop. The red candle, the one painted to drip endlessly in front of the crumbling bell tower. She closed the hymnal slowly, her breath quiet in the cold air. Someone had marked it, or perhaps Jeremy had. A silent nod to something only he understood. She turned toward the altar. The candles there were ivory. No red wax anywhere near them. Jessica's thoughts narrowed. If the backdrop was meant to evoke memory, the wax in the hymnal was no accident. It was a message, a connection, or a warning. And warnings, she had learned, often came just before the past knocked louder. Later that day, Jessica took a solitary walk toward the hill behind the chapel, where the bell tower stood like a silent sentinel, its stone face pitted with age and frost. No bells had rung there in decades, the staircase had been sealed, but its shadow still stretched across the village green, long and indifferent. She paused at the base, her eyes tracing the height of the structure. From a distance, the tower looked strong, but up close, the cracks showed. Jessica had always believed that buildings, like people, told their stories eventually. You just had to be patient enough to listen. A soft sound made her turn. It was Matthew, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. "I come here sometimes," he murmured, "even though I'm not supposed to." Jessica nodded, allowing the moment to settle. "Does it help?" He shrugged. "I think I keep hoping I'll remember something that makes sense." She let the silence linger. Then, "What did Jeremy ask you about that upset you?" Matthew's eyes shifted to the tower. "He thought the tower mattered, that something happened there no one ever talked about. And you?" "I told him to stop." His voice cracked. But he wouldn't. Jessica studied his face. The fear in it wasn't just grief. It was old, rooted, familiar. Someone had wanted the past to stay buried. But Jeremy had begun to dig. Now Jessica wondered, was Jeremy uncovering the truth on his own? Or was someone leading him toward it, for reasons still hidden in the snow? Marlo's hollow wore its Christmas morning like a mask, white, serene, untouched. But beneath the snow-dusted wreaths and candlelit windows, Jessica could feel the hush of unease. As she stepped into the general store for a spool of ribbon Eleanor had forgotten, the quiet murmur of conversation curled through the aisles like smoke. She kept her steps light, her expression casual, but the names being spoken were unmistakable. "Kitteridge," someone whispered behind a display of preserves. "Digging into old business. Is that student, Lillian? What was her last name again?" Jessica paused by a shelf of cinnamon sticks, pretending to read a label. The voices continued. "Jeremy shouldn't have been asking about that tower. You think it's true what they say, that she didn't fall?" Jessica turned slowly, her face unreadable, and made her purchase. As she walked back into the cold, her thoughts were anything but idle. Small towns never forget, they just change the subject. And now, with Jeremy gone and the chapel shadowed by grief, the subject had returned, unbidden and unwelcome. Jessica could feel it pressing in from all sides, a truth never spoken aloud, a question never allowed to finish forming. She pulled her coat tighter and made her way toward the care home just beyond the village square. There was someone there she needed to see, someone who had worked under Lawrence Kitteridge's roof. If anyone knew where the silence began, it would be the man who'd once swept its corners. Amos Drake sat by the window in a faded armchair, his face turned toward the snow-dusted garden beyond the glass. Time had softened him, but his eyes remained sharp, cautious and clear. Jessica greeted him gently. "Mr. Drake, I'm Jessica Fletcher. I'm visiting from Cabot Cove." He nodded. "Eleanor's friend, I remember. I was hoping to ask you about Lawrence Kitteridge and the girl who died at the bell tower." Amos didn't speak immediately. His fingers moved along the edge of his lap blanket, tracing invisible lines in the wool. "People forget," he said finally, "or they pretend to, but I remember the screams." Jessica sat quietly across from him, letting the silence build its own gravity. "She never jumped," Amos said. "They said she did, but they were lying. Everyone knew it, just didn't want it written down." "Who was lying?" Jessica asked softly. Amos looked at her, and in that moment, the weariness in his face fell away. He pushed her. "I saw them argue that night, in the snow. I was sweeping the stairs behind the chapel. She ran up to the tower. He followed. Only one came down." Jessica's breath caught, though her expression didn't falter. "Did you tell anyone?" "I told the sheriff. He told me to keep my broom where it belonged." Outside, a bird startled from the branches. Jessica sat back, the pieces stirring like snowflakes in the wind. She had a name, a motive, a timeline. But she didn't yet have the truth. Because truth, especially the kind buried by respectability, never comes out in a single breath. The village square was quieter now, the carolers' stage dismantled, the festive lights flickering with half-hearted cheer. Jessica's steps led her toward the bakery, its windows fogged with warmth, the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. Inside, Molly Dean moved with mechanical precision, sliding trays of gingerbread from the oven. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were clouded, somewhere else entirely. Jessica approached slowly. "Molly, may I ask you something personal?" Molly stiffened, then nodded. "If it's about Jeremy, I already told the sheriff everything I know." "I'm not questioning that," Jessica said gently. "But I wonder if you knew why Jeremy was looking into the bell tower, why he was asking about Lawrence Kitteridge." Molly's silence was telling. Jessica waited. "I didn't tell him to," Molly said finally. "But I didn't stop him either." Jessica studied her closely. "Because you were looking too?" A pause, then, "Because I have a right to know." Jessica leaned in. "You knew Lillian Cole, didn't you?" Molly's gaze dropped. "She was my grandmother." The words were quiet, deliberate. Jessica felt the weight of them settle between them. "I didn't find out until I was 15, Molly said. "My mother never spoke of it. But the name was on a letter. I came here last year just to see the town. Then I met Jeremy. And he wanted to know the truth too." Jessica felt the pieces begin to align, slowly, precisely. Jeremy's research hadn't been aimless. It had been guided. "Did anyone else know who you were?" she asked. "Eleanor and Jeremy, that's it." Jessica looked down at the gingerbread cooling on the tray. They were shaped like bells, too neat, too symbolic. In Marlo's hollow, memory was a quiet thing, baked into kitchens, hidden in cards, whispered behind closed doors. But Jessica knew. This memory had a name. And now it had a face. Jessica remained with Molly as the scent of gingerbread softened the air around them. The quiet that followed her confession stretched long, but not awkward. Jessica knew the weight of withheld family history, how silence could echo louder than words. "When I found out," Molly continued, not meeting her gaze, "it was like opening a window into a house I didn't know I'd lived in. My mother burned most of Lillian's letters, said it was better that way. Safer?" Jessica nodded slowly. "And yet you came." Molly looked up, eyes clear now. "Because I needed to know if she jumped, or if she was pushed." Jessica studied her for a moment. There was no malice in the girl, only grief, sharpened by absence. A need not for revenge, but for understanding. That was what had drawn Jeremy too. "He believed the truth could heal something," Molly said, "even if it hurt first." Jessica's eyes softened. "Sometimes it can." She thought of Eleanor, of her guarded words and gentle deflections, of Amos Drake, tucked away in a care home with truths locked behind his teeth, of Matthew, shaking in the cold, burdened by a name he never asked for. And now, Molly, unknowingly at the heart of a story whose ending had been hastily written decades ago. Jessica's mind lingered on the backdrop painting once more. The red candle, the bell tower, the snow. It wasn't just a pageant set, it was a memory rendered in symbols. And someone had wanted it seen. "Molly," she asked softly, "who painted that backdrop in the attic?" Molly hesitated. "It was already here when I arrived, but Jeremy said he thought it was a confession." Jessica felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. So much had been painted over, but the canvas had never really been blank. The next morning brought a quiet light to Eleanor's sitting room, filtering through lace curtains and casting shadows over the old oak desk tucked beneath the front window. Jessica stood beside it, her fingers running absently along the grain, her thoughts elsewhere. "Eleanor," she asked gently, "did Lillian ever write to you after she left school?" Eleanor looked up from her knitting, eyes unreadable. "She wrote once," she said. "A long letter. I never answered it." Jessica waited. Finally, Eleanor stood and crossed to the desk. She opened the bottom drawer, rummaged briefly, then withdrew a faded envelope. The seal was unbroken. "She asked me not to read it unless something happened to her," Eleanor said. "But I never believed anything would. And then when she died, I couldn't bring myself to look." Jessica accepted the letter with care. The paper was thin and yellowed, the handwriting fluid and sure. L.C. inside was a single sheet. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't survive telling the truth. I only ever wanted to be seen for who I was, not what I wasn't allowed to be. If Lawrence chooses to lie, I hope someone remembers me without shame." Jessica read the words in silence, then folded the paper slowly. The grief in the letter was sharp, not theatrical, but deeply human. "She trusted you," Jessica said softly. Eleanor's voice broke. "And I failed her." "No," Jessica replied gently. "You loved her, and love, even if kept silent, leaves a mark." Her fingers lingered on the envelope. The letter wasn't a confession, it was a memorial, and it had waited too long to be read. That evening, as twilight deepened over the chapel, Jessica found Matthew standing alone at the edge of the path near the bell tower, his face pale against the violet dusk. She approached slowly. "Matthew?" He turned toward her with a startled expression, then glanced quickly back at the tower. "She was there," he whispered. "I swear I saw her." Jessica stepped closer, her voice calm. "Who?" "A woman, standing by the bell tower. Her dress was white. The wind moved through it, but she didn't seem cold. She looked right at me, and then—" He trailed off, shivering. Jessica's gaze moved toward the structure, aged stone, crumbling ivy, and long closed windows. Empty, but not entirely still. "You're not losing your mind," she said softly. "You're carrying something. Sometimes memory disguises itself as vision when we don't know how else to process what's inside." Matthew's shoulders hunched. "I wanted to believe my father was a good man." "Wanting doesn't make it so," Jessica replied gently. "But neither does guilt pass through blood like inheritance. What you do with the truth, that's yours." He closed his eyes, breath shaking. Jessica watched him, her own thoughts turning. The boy wasn't fragile, he was fractured. And perhaps, like Molly, he had also come here not to bury the past, but to face it. The question was, who else had come, and how far would they go to make sure their version of the truth stayed buried? Jessica returned to the chapel attic the following morning, climbing the narrow staircase slowly, each wooden step creaking like a whispered memory. Her thoughts remained with Matthew, his pale face, his whispered claim of seeing someone in white. Jessica didn't believe in ghosts, not exactly, but she did believe in guilt. And guilt had a habit of dressing itself in familiar shapes. The attic smelled of dust and old linen. Light spilled through the single window, casting a pale glow over the stacked props. Jessica moved to the canvas-covered panel she'd seen before and gently pulled the covering down further than she had the first time. There, fully revealed, was the backdrop. The bell tower loomed large, painted in cold stone greys and slate blue. Its top was fractured, a jagged line suggesting something crumbled or broken. And in the foreground, unmistakable now, stood a young woman in a pale dress, one arm outstretched toward the tower, the other lowered, as if falling. At her feet, the red candle, dripping, always dripping. Jessica took a breath. This wasn't simply a theatrical set piece, it was a portrait, a moment frozen in time. And the details, the angle of the tower, the exact curve of the woman's hand, were too precise to have come from imagination. Someone had been there. Someone had seen what happened that night. She knelt beside the canvas, scanning the lower edge. A faint signature, almost lost in the paint. M.K. Jessica's thoughts sharpened. Matthew. She stood, heart steady. Had Jeremy discovered this? Had he confronted Matthew with it? Or had Matthew painted it with Jeremy, as a way to finally face what he feared? Jessica didn't yet know, but the truth had been rendered here, quietly, with brush and colour. And now it waited to be acknowledged. That afternoon, Jessica stopped by Jeremy's cottage one last time, a place now frozen in grief and unfinished thoughts. With Eleanor's quiet permission, she sorted through the documents left behind, notebooks, sermon sheets, and a stack of manila folders bound with twine. Tucked inside one of the folders was another torn journal page, different from the one she'd found in his coat. This one was older. The ink had bled slightly along the crease. The date in the top corner, October 12th, 1972. I told her it wasn't safe to speak. Not now, not yet. She said love should never be hidden. I told her silence was a form of love too, the only kind I could offer. When she threatened to make it public, I panicked. I followed her. She fell. Or maybe I let her. Jessica read the final line twice. Or maybe I let her. There was no signature, but the writing matched the style of the earlier note, elegant, commanding. It was Lawrence Kitteridge's. She sat down slowly. He had admitted it, at least to himself. The language was carefully ambiguous, as if hoping that half a confession would absolve him from the whole. She traced the page with her fingers. It wasn't the words that struck her most. It was what was missing. No mention of sorrow, no acknowledgement of consequence, just rationalization. A brilliant man, a respected figure, a quiet manipulator, and Jeremy had found this. Jessica looked toward the window where dusk began to press against the panes. Jeremy had come close to speaking the truth aloud, and someone had silenced him, just as someone had tried to silence Lillian. Back at Eleanor's that evening, Jessica brought the diary page to the table with quiet care. The fire crackled behind her, its warmth no match for the weight of what she was about to ask. "Eleanor," she said gently, "do you still keep your old school scrapbooks?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, then softened with understanding. "You think I kept more than memories?" Jessica nodded. "Sometimes we hold on to things we wish we hadn't. Not because we need them, but because we're afraid of what might happen if they disappear." Eleanor rose without protest. From a side cupboard, she pulled a worn binder. Its leather cracked, its corners frayed. Inside were yellowed programs, photos of graduating classes, old newspaper clippings, and tucked inside a plastic sleeve near the back, a handwritten thank you note dated November 1971. Jessica pulled the letter free and held it beside the diary page. The ink, the spacing, the distinctive upward slant on the letter F. It was the same hand. "Lawrence wrote this?" Jessica asked. Eleanor nodded. "He sent one to each faculty member after his re-election as chair. It was his way of showing control. Polished, formal, always calculated." Jessica folded the journal page beside it. Jeremy hadn't stumbled into this. He had traced it, line by line. And someone else had likely helped him do it, which meant the danger hadn't come from what he suspected, but from what he had begun to prove. Jessica looked once more at the scrapbook, a place where pride, history, and quiet omissions shared space. The tower had kept its secrets, but its echoes had found their way into ink. Jessica found Matthew seated alone in the back pew of the chapel, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if holding something fragile. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, the remnants of Christmas decorations still clinging to the rafters like forgotten verses of a carol. She sat beside him, saying nothing at first. The silence wasn't awkward, only tentative, like the hush before confession. "I know what you found," Jessica said softly. Matthew didn't move. "The painting?" She nodded. "And the journal? Jeremy trusted you." His voice came slowly, as if pulled from a place deeper than breath. "I didn't mean to find it. I was restoring part of the old bell tower base, just helping clean out the foundation stones, repointing the mortar. Behind one of the bricks, there was a metal box, rusted shut. I broke it open." Jessica listened without interruption, letting his story arrive in its own time. "There were letters," Matthew continued, "and those pages. I didn't understand them at first. It felt like reading someone else's conscience." He looked up at her. "Jeremy helped me make sense of them. He said truth doesn't decay, it just waits." Jessica felt the weight of that line settle between them. "I didn't want to believe it," Matthew whispered. "I thought maybe Lillian was troubled, that it was a tragic accident. But the things my father wrote, he knew what he'd done. And so did my mother." Jessica's eyes searched his face, pale, lined with sleeplessness, but honest. "You never told Jeremy to stop," she said. Matthew shook his head. "Number Y asked him to help me decide. I thought, maybe if we brought it into the light, the shame would go away." Jessica placed a gentle hand on his arm. "The truth doesn't erase shame," she said. "But it gives it shape. And that's how healing begins." Jessica remained beside Matthew as the light from the stained glass windows faded into late afternoon hues. The chapel grew colder, the air laced with quiet history and the faint scent of wax. Matthew's shoulders, once rigid, had begun to soften under the weight of what had been said aloud. "I wasn't trying to expose anyone," he said. "I wasn't looking for revenge. I've lived my whole life not knowing what my father truly was. He was good to me, kind. But there were days when I saw something behind his eyes, a silence too rehearsed." Jessica nodded slowly. "The kind of silence that doesn't protect but controls." "I didn't want it to stay buried," Matthew continued. "Not because I hate him, but because I want to stop fearing the pieces I inherited. I want to stop wondering if part of me is capable of the same." Jessica let that rest. His words didn't surprise her. Sons often searched for the truth of their fathers in the quiet spaces, in what was left behind, in what was never said aloud. "I thought if the truth came out," Matthew went on, "it might allow people to grieve properly, not just Lillian, but everyone who's been carrying the silence." Jessica looked toward the altar, where the red sanctuary candle flickered low. "Some truths don't bring peace right away," she said softly. "They break something first. But if you're willing to face the break, peace can follow." Matthew drew a shaky breath. Jeremy believed that too. He said the truth wasn't a weapon. It was an invitation. Jessica's gaze lingered on the flame. And somewhere beneath it all, the bell tower remembered, not in chimes, but in the courage of those who finally chose to listen. The next morning brought with it a grey stillness, the kind that blanketed the village in something colder than snow. A hush born not of weather, but of reckoning. Jessica sat at Eleanor's writing desk, the diary pages, the painting photograph, and Lillian's letter carefully arranged before her like the final lines of a novel. There was nothing more to search for now, only something to face. The truth, she had come to realize, didn't live in the tower or the hymnals or even in Jeremy's torn notes. It lived in people, in what they chose to carry and what they tried to forget. Jessica folded the papers, placed them neatly into a manila envelope, and slipped it into her handbag. Outside, she walked slowly to the Kitteridge estate. The house stood as it always had, dignified, imposing, wrapped in ivy like it had nothing to explain. But the woman behind its doors had run out of places to hide. Winifred answered on the second knock. Her eyes were tired but sharp. Jessica saw a flicker of recognition, not surprise, but resignation. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said with brittle grace, I imagine this isn't a social call." "No," Jessica said quietly. "But it is a kind one." Winifred hesitated. For a heartbeat, something passed across her face, a private calculation, perhaps, or the final edge of denial. "Then I suppose," she said, opening the door wider, "we had best speak the truth." Jessica stepped inside, the weight of what was to come already heavy between them. They sat in the front drawing room, a place where portraits of ancestors lined the walls and a silver clock ticked with unbroken precision. Jessica laid the envelope between them on the polished table, but did not open it. Winifred's eyes lingered on it as though she already knew what was inside. "You've spoken with Matthew," she said, more a statement than a question. Jessica nodded. "And with Eleanor, and Amos Drake, and Jeremy Holt left behind more than questions." Winifred gave a slow exhale, her poise slipping slightly at the name. Jessica continued, her voice gentle but direct. "You were at the bell tower the night Lillian died." For a moment, Winifred said nothing. Then she looked at Jessica, not with fear or defiance, but with something strangely close to relief. "I followed Lawrence," she said softly. "I wasn't supposed to. He left the house after dinner, said he had a meeting. I didn't believe him." Her hands folded tightly in her lap, one thumb rubbing the base of her other hand, a motion Jessica had seen before, the body's reflex to remembering something it never wanted to relive. "I saw them arguing. She was pleading with him. She wanted him to acknowledge her publicly, to admit what they were to each other. She said she would go to the board, the press. She wasn't hysterical, Mrs. Fletcher, just determined." Winifred swallowed. "I confronted them. I shouted at her. She said I was part of the problem, that I was the reason he would never tell the truth." Jessica waited, saying nothing. "She turned from me," Winifred continued, voice breaking now. "And in that moment, I don't know if I meant to push her, but I did, or I tried to stop her. But she pulled away and slipped." Jessica heard the dissonance in the phrasing, a truth tangled with justification. "Lawrence came down after me. He looked at her body, and then at me, and said only one thing: 'No one must ever know.' And I agreed. I told him I would carry it with me." "You both did," Jessica said. "But you didn't carry it alone." Winifred's eyes closed. "No," she whispered. "We made sure of that." The room had grown colder, as though the weight of the past had lowered the very temperature. Jessica watched Winifred carefully. There was no triumph in this, only the slow, aching release that came when the last thread of secrecy frayed. "We didn't speak of it again," Winifred said. "He boarded up the tower 2 days later, had it declared structurally unsound. The school followed quietly. The press release mentioned a tragic accident. Nothing more." Jessica's hands rested lightly in her lap. "And when Lillian's name was mentioned?" Winifred's mouth tightened. "We buried her again, every time." Jessica let the silence grow between them. When she spoke, her voice was low. "You sent the Christmas cards, didn't you? At least some of them." Winifred looked away. Jessica continued. "The ones left in Jeremy's bag, unsigned, but written with regret. They weren't threats. They were apologies." A tremor passed through Winifred's shoulders. "He was so much like her," she said. "Bright, passionate, brave. And I knew from the beginning that he would reach the truth. He asked about the backdrop, about the hymnals, about Matthew." She looked at Jessica now, eyes glassed but sharp. "He told me he planned to speak after the pageant, that he would submit the journal pages to the Historical Society and the school board." Jessica's breath caught. "And so you confronted him?" Winifred nodded. "In the confessional," Jessica said. "I only meant to reason with him. I brought the rosary as a gesture. I thought if I spoke as a mother, he might hesitate." But he was resolute. He said the silence had already killed once. Her voice cracked. "I touched his arm. Just his arm. I didn't strike him." But he startled, jerked back, and fell against the partition. Jessica exhaled. Not a planned murder, but panic, consequence born of avoidance. "I sat beside him," Winifred whispered, "for nearly 10 minutes, hoping he might wake up. But he didn't." Jessica said nothing. Some stories end in violence, others in silence, and some, most quietly of all, in guilt finally given voice. Winifred sat very still in the armchair by the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jessica watched her in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that doesn't press, but waits, gently, respectfully, and with the weight of knowing. "He didn't raise his voice," Winifred said finally. That was the most unsettling part. I had prepared myself for fury, condemnation, but Jeremy was calm. She looked up, eyes shining. "He said he pitied me." Jessica remained still. Winifred continued, her voice steadying. "He told me the village deserved the truth, that I'd stolen something from it, the right to grieve honestly. And from Matthew, he said the silence I'd maintained wasn't strength, it was fear." Jessica listened, letting the words form their own echo in the room. "I told him it would destroy us," Winifred whispered. "The school, my family, Eleanor. He said that what had already been buried had done far more damage than what would be uncovered." A small pause. "And then he said something I haven't been able to forget. He said, 'It's not too late to be brave, but it may be too late to be forgiven.'" Jessica's breath caught slightly at the weight of it. That sounded like Jeremy, young, principled, and painfully aware of the cost of truth. "I didn't mean to harm him," Winifred said, her voice breaking now. "I truly didn't. But when I saw he wouldn't bend, when he made it clear he would go public, with or without my blessing, something in me panicked." She clutched the rosary still hanging from her wrist, the beads clicking faintly between her fingers. "I reached out to stop him from leaving the confessional. Not violently, just to pause him. He pulled away too quickly, lost his balance. The side panel was warped. He struck it badly." Jessica closed her eyes for a moment. The detail fit. The timeline, the injury, the lack of external trauma. Everything Jeremy had uncovered had brought him to that moment. And Winifred had made a last, desperate attempt to stop time from moving forward. "But I didn't call for help," Winifred whispered. "Not even then. That was my choice, my true failure." And in that confession, soft, unadorned, Jessica heard not the echo of a murderer, but of a woman who had made one terrible choice, and then built her life around the effort not to look at it. Jessica leaned back slightly in her chair, the envelope still untouched on the table. Winifred's confession lingered in the air, weighty but strangely quiet, like the hush that follows a long, overdue rain. "I've told you more than I ever intended," Winifred said, smoothing the creases in her skirt with trembling fingers. "Perhaps more than you even wanted to know." Jessica didn't answer right away. She watched Winifred's face, lined and proud, but exhausted in a way that came not from sleepless nights, but from decades of carrying something alone. "No," Jessica said gently, "it's not more than I wanted to know. It's what needed to be known." Winifred gave a faint, humorless smile. "And what now? Will you tell the sheriff?" Jessica considered this. "I think," she said slowly, "you already know what you need to do." Winifred nodded once. "I will speak to him on my own terms, and I will speak to Matthew too." Jessica allowed herself a breath. She had not come here seeking punishment, only the truth, and for someone willing to face it. "I used to think," Winifred added quietly, "that if I just stayed quiet long enough, the past would forget me. But it doesn't forget, it waits, just like guilt." Jessica's eyes softened. "And sometimes it waits for someone brave enough to stop running." The fire crackled beside them. Jessica stood, gathering her things. She left the envelope unopened. It was no longer necessary. At the door, Winifred paused. "Mrs. Fletcher, do you believe I'm a terrible person?" Jessica turned to her, meeting her gaze with a calm that had steadied many others. "I believe," she said, "that people are rarely as simple as good or bad. You lived with the weight of something unforgivable. But now, you've begun to tell the truth." Winifred bowed her head. "I only wish I'd done it sooner." Jessica stepped out into the crisp evening air. The wind stirred the snow in soft spirals, and somewhere behind her the long silence had finally begun to end. New Year's Eve arrived in Marlo's Hollow with a quiet solemnity. Snow pressed softly against the windows of the chapel, and the bells, for the first time in weeks, rang gently at dusk. Jessica entered alone, but she was not the only one drawn there that evening. The villagers had come not for a sermon or song, but for stillness. Upon the altar stood 2 unadorned candles, one taller than the other, both lit by Eleanor Kittredge's hand. No plaque, no inscription, only the flames and their hush. Jessica sat toward the back. A few pews ahead, she recognized faces: Amos Drake, Matthew, Molly, even the sheriff. No one spoke. But in that silence, Jessica sensed something collective, not just grief, but release. She folded her gloved hands and watched the taller flame flicker. That one, she suspected, had been for Jeremy. The smaller, more fragile, prone to tremble, was for Lillian Cole. Lillian, whose story had lived only in whispers, and Jeremy, who had insisted it be told aloud. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment. The chapel no longer held secrets. It held memory. As Eleanor stepped away from the altar, her shoulders squared with a kind of weary grace. Jessica noted the slight pause as Eleanor passed the candle meant for Jeremy. A pause not of guilt, but reverence. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But within the chapel, light held steady against the dark. Jessica's thoughts lingered on what had been lost, and what had been kept alive, quietly, in those who remained, and in that fragile, flickering space between forgiveness and remembrance. The hollow breathed again. After the chapel emptied, Jessica remained seated until only Molly lingered at the side aisle. The young woman was quiet, her face pale but determined, as if some question had finally settled into an answer. Jessica approached gently, and Molly turned with a faint smile. "I wasn't sure whether I'd stay," she admitted. "But I've decided." Jessica studied her. There was something steadier in her now, not just resolution, but purpose. "I spoke with the community board," Molly continued. "They've offered me a teaching position, starting in the spring term, literature and writing." Jessica's eyebrows rose with quiet approval. "Your grandmother would have liked that." Molly nodded. "That's part of why I'm doing it. Not because she was perfect, she wasn't, but because she tried to give me something she never had, a chance." Jessica saw the young woman's hands, trembling just slightly. She remembered her own first class, decades ago, and the blend of fear and wonder that came with the weight of shaping young minds. "There's an old wooden desk in the back of the schoolroom," Molly added. "Cracked on one side. She must have used it." Jessica smiled. "Well, perhaps you'll mend it, or leave the crack as memory." Molly looked down. "I think I'll leave it." There was no ceremony to her choice, no dramatic gesture, just the quiet decision of someone choosing to build forward, brick by steady brick. As they stepped outside into the crisp night, Molly's breath formed a cloud before her. Jessica thought, sometimes healing doesn't roar. It whispers, like a candle rekindled in the snow. The following morning, the chapel doors were open again, though no service was scheduled. Jessica paused at the threshold, surprised to hear music drifting faintly from within. Not the triumphant swell of a choir, but something more intimate. Organ keys pressed, with tentative care, forming an old melody she could almost name. She stepped in. At the organ sat Matthew. His posture was humble, almost apologetic, but his fingers moved with a kind of reverence. Jessica remained at the back, letting the notes speak. The music had no words, but it didn't need them. It carried what Matthew could not say aloud, the ache of silence, the burden of knowing, and the quiet release of telling. When he noticed her presence, Matthew did not stop, but his gaze met hers briefly. In that glance, Jessica saw a man who had carried guilt for too long, and who now, with every chord, was laying it down. After a final soft note, he closed the cover and turned. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here," he said quietly. Jessica offered a gentle smile. "Some places forgive more easily than we expect," he exhaled. "I'm not sure I deserve that." "Deserving," she said, "is rarely the point. Listening is." Matthew nodded once, and for the first time in weeks Jessica saw the corners of his mouth lift, not into joy but into peace. The organ would play again, not perfectly, not as before, but with a voice that remembered and endured. That evening, Jessica returned to the cottage, removed her coat, and sat down with her notebook. She opened to a fresh page. Her handwriting, steady and neat, filled the top margin with the words, "The Hollow Truth." She paused. So much had been laid bare in these past days, lies unspoken, grief unvoiced, love unlived. And yet somehow the village had not fractured. It had softened. The truth had not broken Marlo's hollow. It had let it exhale. She wrote, "Sometimes silence is protection. Other times it's a prison. Only when we name our shadows do we begin to live beside them." Her pen hovered above the page. She thought of Winifred, stoic to the end, of Molly's voice in the schoolroom, of Matthew's hands on the organ, and of Jeremy, too young, too brave, but not forgotten. In small towns, stories are not buried. They are folded into hymnals, tucked behind portraits, whispered under snow. She underlined one word in her notes, grace, because truth, she had learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it came softly, late and trembling, but still welcome. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the glass. Jessica closed her notebook. She had come here thinking she would write about a holiday retreat. Instead, she would write about legacy and the quiet courage it takes to unbury the past. And somewhere beneath the layers of winter, she felt it. Life, waiting to begin again. Jessica remained still for a long while after closing her notebook. There were no more footsteps to trace, no more secrets to pull from shadows. Only the echo of what had been revealed, and the stillness left in its wake. She thought of Winifred's words, "I only wish I'd done it sooner." And then of Jeremy's, "It may be too late to be forgiven." Jessica had written dozens of stories about guilt, justice, and the need to confess. But even now she found herself circling one question she could not quite answer. When someone tells the truth too late, is it redemption? Or is it only an echo, faint, mournful, reaching toward a light it may never touch? She didn't write that question down. Some truths, she knew, must be left unanswered, not for lack of clarity, but because mystery, like forgiveness, lives best in the quiet spaces. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. The hollow would sleep now, its breath slow and untroubled. Jessica stood, folded her shawl, and moved toward the fire. Some stories ended not with justice or closure, but with a single candle flickering against the dark. And for now, that would be enough. Sometimes the softest voices carry the truths that echo the longest, across time, across loss, and across the fragile spaces between guilt and grace. But I wonder, if Jeremy hadn't pressed for the truth, would the past have stayed buried forever, or found another way to rise? I'd love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts or your theory in the comments below. And if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with me, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves a good whodunit, and subscribe for more stories where secrets never stay silent.